Good morning, grasshoppers. Friday morning here, beautiful day, and I just wanted to touch base with you on Chapter 3, the Libertarianism. Now, you'll notice that there's a quiz in your folder, but that's not due, I think, until Wednesday. So I've given you some extra time to do that. And but anyway, I just wanted to touch base with you on this libertarian chapter. Libertarianism is a philosophy that back in the 70s and 80s was really a big deal. And a number of books came out on it, and I read them and studied them and taught some of that stuff in the university. But at the end of the day, libertarianism, on page 59, for example, libertarianism favors unfettered markets and oppose government regulation, not in the name of economic efficiency, but in the name of human freedom. So there are several questions that come to my mind here. One is that you beg the question of what is human freedom? What does it mean? How is it arrived? Um, and what are the extensions of it? The other notion that strikes me is to what degree do we have uh, small government and no interference and things of that nature. And I like the way that Sandel presents this from the perspective that you're under a libertarian notion, you are free to do whatever you wish so long as you are not infringing on the rights of anyone else or hurting anyone else, things of that nature. So when we look at some of the examples that are afforded in the text, uh, economics and social freedom, and what do we do with our own money, what rights, prerogatives does the government have to tax and things of that nature. We have to try to keep in mind that the government has a right to tax to maintain the law and order and safety and whatever of the society and the economy, and that takes money. Now, the folks, the libertarians who are saying, well, I want to pay a fair tax. Well, most libertarians say I don't want to pay any tax, which of course is absurd. And the notion is when do we have a fair tax, and is it equally distributed, that sense of fair tax? So one of the questions that comes about is, do the rich have an obligation to pay more because they have more, or do we just have a standard flat tax for whatever? Those are questions that have been debated since Noah got off the ark, and they're still not satisfactorily resolved. I like to think that a fair way to have equitable tax in this culture would be to have a graduated flat income tax. So, why is that reasonable? Well, if you have a flat tax, 10%, as an example, we're just working at as an example. So 10% tax on someone who's making $11,000 a year is repressive. You're talking about $1,100. And that is an exorbitant amount of money for those people. Whereas 10% on someone making $500 to $1 million a year is nothing. And so that notion of relativity comes into play. So if you had a graduated flat tax, everybody pays something. For example, if you made $11,000 a year, and maybe a tax of $100 or a couple of $100 would be fair. You're paying something, but it's not oppressive. If you're making $25,000 a year, maybe you're going to pay 2% or something of that nature. And if you're making a considerable amount more, say $300,000-400,000 a year, well, you can afford 10%. And if you're making considerably more than that, you see where the tax rate would go up in increments. That would be not repressive, but it would be paying a fair share of your income. And remember that originally there was no income tax in this country, and it didn't start until the early part of the 19th century. I'm sorry, of the 20th century. And that's when they instituted the income tax. We can debate the legitimacy of the income tax till the cows come home, but the state, the government, they need tax revenue to facilitate the job that government needs to do. How you're going to generate that revenue is an issue certainly for debate. And I'm not going to try to resolve it here as much as I'm just sharing if you're going to do income tax, and there's a way to do it. And I think that the way that it's being done now, it benefits some groups and it hurts others. Sandel and Solomon raised the question: is that fair? Is that justice? So those are questions that folks sort of wrestle with. And the on page 81, conservatives who favor laissez-faire economic policies often part company with libertarians on cultural issues such as school prayer, abortion, restrictions on pornography, etc., etc. Here again, you see the distinction between economic conservatism and social libertarianism. And that is one of the things that's always important to keep in mind. It appears when you read through the literature and you read through the arguments and things of that nature that conservatives have a tendency to want to legislate morality. And libertarians argue that that is an abridgment of fundamental freedom that human beings have, especially when it gets into this sort of seamy areas of pornography and sexual license and things of that nature. The conservative mindset has a tendency to sort of frown on that. But the libertarians are arguing that, look, that's human freedom, and we ought to be able to do that so long as we are not infringing on anyone's rights or violating people. So, for example, if you have an adult who's preying on children for sexual access, that is illegal for a very good reason, and it violates the rights of protection of the minor, for example. So libertarians don't have a problem with that. But between consenting adults, why ought the state have the prerogative to legislate a moral that prohibits any behavior that two consenting adults want to engage in? Conservatives have a different view. They're saying that this is not morally right, and therefore we want that type of behavior banned and things of that nature. So it's important that we understand those lines of demarcation, so to speak, between the two schools of thought. On page 62, is it 62? Yes, it's a little dark in here to see this. Yeah, 62. The other one was on 61. So the free market philosophy. One of there are whole degrees that are granted on people who study the implications of laissez-faire or free market economies versus controlled economies and things of that nature. One of the things I want to share with you is that in the United States, we don't live in a laissez-faire economy. We have what's called a mixed economy. So it's partly laissez-faire, partly hands-off, partly a free market, and then partly a controlled market. And that's why it's called a mixed economy. But the philosophers that they're talking about, Robert Nozick, for example, is very, very important in terms of what they're arguing. And the notion is, when does the government have the responsibility, not just a prerogative, but the responsibility to step in and regulate the market? Even Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations argued that an unfettered market is just absurd. You cannot have an unfettered economy, because if you have an unfettered economy, one of the extensions of that is that you allow the mafia to take over, for example. It's an unfettered, unlicensed, unregulated economy. So if the mafia steps in and controls all of the construction in New York, then, well, that's just part of the market. And that's the part of the way the free economy works. So surely we can see that that type of situation is not acceptable. So we want to keep in mind those notions of the unfettered economy. Michael Jordan's money. I quite frankly, I really enjoyed this section. So Michael Jordan makes more money than most of us are ever going to see in our lifetime. Is he worth it? Well, the question comes down to, apparently he is, because there are groups, people, owners that are willing to pay him that kind of money. And in a laissez-faire economy, a free economy, competitive economy, if we can look at it that way, in a competitive economy, certainly that's warranted because owners are willing to pay that kind of money, because folks, the public, John Q. public, they're willing to pay the price tickets to go and see him play. But there are folks that argue that that kind of income, whether it's Michael Jordan or Bill Gates or Murdoch or any number of people who are fabulously wealthy, Jeff Bezos, for example, that level of income ought to be heavily taxed. Some argue to the tune of 50%. And in England, it is. In some of the European countries, England won. That's one of the reasons why the Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney or whatever, took up American citizenship, because they didn't want to pay the exorbitant tax on the vast amount of money that those folks were making. So that's a debate that goes on, and in some sense, the verdict is not in yet on the legitimacy of how much ought particular individuals to command in an economy. Your author makes a point that the top 1% control 40% of the wealth in this country. Is that legitimate? Not only is it legitimate, but is it wise business? Is it is it good for the economy to have that amount of wealth tied up in such a tiny segment of the population? That's a serious argument. And it would seem very clear to any number of thinkers that distributing that wealth, I don't like the word distributing it, but I like the better phrase of having greater access to earning some of that wealth, maybe through higher wages, et cetera, through more employment options, would better serve the economy and the country as a whole than the way the system is set up now, especially when you consider the top 5% control 70% of the wealth. And it starts to almost become ridiculous in, the way things are set up, especially when you have the vast levels of poverty and things of that nature that go on for the working class and the poor and things of that nature. You really need to ask yourself, Peter Singer asks this question very well, what kind of a society do you want to live in? And if you're going to have a fair and equitable society, you're going to want to make people that make sure that there are folks that don't have to live under the bridge, if you can put it that way. So when we look at this chapter on libertarianism and the wealth that goes on and how we in our society have decided to distribute wealth and income and services in our society, some serious ethical and philosophical questions are raised. And that's why this chapter is very important. Now, I think that reasonable people are very attuned to wanting liberty and human freedom. And we don't want that freedom infringed upon. So that becomes a very important issue. John Rawls, for example, in one of his very famous works, Justice is Fairness, argued that what we could do is set up a society where the folks that are making the rules are not sure where they're going to be in that society. And would that allow us to have a fairer, more equitable sense of distribution in that particular society? And try to keep in mind that equitability is not about everybody being equal. It's about folks having the equal opportunities to manifest their particular skills and their particular resources to achieve the success and things that they want in their culture. So one of the things that philosophers like to do is to let's sort out the terms. And so as you're going through this chapter, please try to keep that in mind, that what they're trying to do here is to clarify some of the terms for us. My suspicions are that when you finish reading this chapter, if you were to just do a survey among your pals and you were to ask them, define libertarianism for me, I've got money on the table that most of them can't, not effectively. And that most folks have a very distorted view of what libertarianism means or the philosophical underpinnings of it. So one of the notions that strikes me as we go through these particular chapters is that that's what we're trying to do, clarify some of these terms, get some of these concepts sorted out in our head, and to be able to effectively work on that. So the chapter on this quiz, not hard, but make sure you read it, is due, I think, Wednesday. Other than that, I have been just looking at the grades and the assignments. Everybody seems to be doing just a fine job. So I think you're doing well. We both know that the COVID, the corona problem is just causing all kinds of grief with folks. And so be careful out there, and we'll catch up with you. If you have any questions, drop me a line.